Once
400
again,
chapters
there's
of Genesis.
Is there anything
Once again,
controversial
there's so
before we get
much.
into it? Wait, let's-
There's always
Was Abraham a real
controversial
person?
stuff. All right. Well, with that, we'll start off.
Yeah.
Welcome back to part 2 of Genesis, and we're picking up in chapter 11 of Genesis. So if you guys are tracking along, we're going to cover the Tower of Babel all the way up through a little bit of Abraham's descendants, and then next week we'll pick up the rest of Genesis. So a big undertaking, but we're going to start off with Genesis chapter 11, Tower of Babel. One of the things that I'm seeing, at least, is that there seems to be a theme. God has a lot of people wandering. You know, they're sent out from the Garden of Eden, of course, in the beginning. These people like to make cities for themselves, and the cities are often seen and portrayed in a bad light as we continue through this. But of course, the bigger issue is that people are following the command of God versus kind of going against the command of God. And with the Tower of Babel, we're certainly seeing that because they just spell it out for us.
So, man, we're going to touch the obvious. Can we not still see the same trends today?
I was going to let you do it.
I did. There it is. Here's the problem. I think whenever we finally get to it, the more people you get together, the more sin you're going to have.
Yeah.
It's sin because the equation's the same, right? We are the problem. It's not that, buildings together are a problem. It's that people together tend to digress. And there is something, sincerely, there's something that is beneficial for mankind with just a touch of, I won't say loneliness, but some alone time. I think it's if we fill all of our time with stuff and there's always people around and then there's not enough time to perhaps think deep or consider life, come to some realities.
Well, and that's kind of what I've said for a long time, and I say it a lot with the youth. So many times we feel like we are far away from God because we are away from God-made things as opposed to being constantly surrounded by man-made things. And so when we're constantly inside, we're constantly going from one thing to another, and technology and all that type of stuff. These are all man-made things. And so it's harder to see a creator when you're not out in creation. And so that's at least part of it, I think.
I agree with that.
It's not, I wouldn't say it's 100% across the board because there's some people out there that are pretty, they live off grid and they're still denying Christ.
Sure, right. but
I
some
think
alone
it
time
helps.
can be beneficial, and then to God's creation can be beneficial.
So the main thing is they desired to make a name for themselves. That's what they wanted. That's what we're going to do. We're going to build this tower. We're going to make this city. We're going to make it great. We kind of get this idea that they are trying to provide their own salvation is ultimately what it boils down to. And God says, no, we can fix this.
Yeah. Well, and it goes back to the same situation we have. It's either about us or about him, right?
Yeah.
And so we get to see this is one of the ways they made it about them. When you first read this, you think, well, why does God care
Yeah.
if they have a city? And why does he care if they build a tower? Some people say, we're going to go try to get to heaven. Well, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that concept. It doesn't say that precisely as far as, where God resides. But there is definitely trying to create some monument for themselves.
Yeah. And self-sufficiency, I guess, is a good way to put it, as opposed to dependency. A lot of people will say, Christians, you guys just use God as a crutch. And we would answer that, well, yeah, of course. Because when you realize that you are, in fact, dependent, you realize your need. And that's essentially what it boils down to. And this pride is saying, no, I don't need God.
Yeah.
And so that's what they're dealing with.
Well, I think that's whenever we read verse 6, when God talks about nothing they plan to do will be beyond them, I think he's speaking to their concept of life. Obviously, there will be things that people can't do, right? But God is saying that they won't see their need.
Yeah.
They'll be so self-sufficient that they won't recognize that they are actually inept, that they have a huge need.
Yeah, that's kind of what it goes back to as well with the man-made thing. So when we're seeing wealth and prosperity, definitely shows that. The people that are often wealthy, we saw that with, Jesus responding to the rich young ruler, and he's saying, well, it's easier for the camel to go through the eye of a needle than for you to come to Christ, basically, for you to see who I am, because wealth can get in the way. And I think that's primarily because, and I would add to that the health as well. But I mean, when we have things that are going well, then we don't turn to God as often and as easily as quickly. One question that I do have here for you guys is, at least the way that it's portrayed, it almost seems as though God is intimidated by this, and we know that that's not the case. And it's mostly just coming from the fact that, the way it's worded, nothing that they do is impossible for them type idea. And I know I guess you kind of hit on that a little bit, so maybe it doesn't go beyond what you
Well,
already
and I think
mentioned.
God obviously can see where this is headed, that it's just going to lead them further away rather than closer in.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and I think, too, that God wanted people to scatter. And since that was one of the things that he accomplished at at this point. And if they built a city, then they wouldn't scatter because they'd all come to this city because they're one community. We crave community. And I think it goes back to the self-sufficiency too. Like we'll have everything we need if we are living in this.
Yeah.
And God didn't want that. He wanted them to be populating the earth.
Right.
He's like, we're gonna use this as a catalyst.
Yeah.
And so it is interesting to see the contrast within that. So on the one hand, at the very least, their perception of themselves is if we can complete this feat, then we will be self-sufficient and all that. It just shows God's sovereignty and working what they thought was going to be good and how they were going to work it out. It's really just accomplishing God's plan. So we get to Shem's descendants and Terah's descendants. Do you guys have anything within that? So that's the rest of chapter 11, basically, after the Tower of
it's
Babylon.
just like an interesting shift. Like when you're reading this and all of a sudden it switches back over to Shem, like, okay, we already heard about this guy. Why are we going back to him? I kind of see it as the Tower of Babel is like laying the foundation for the climate at the time. Like this is the way Earth was going. So now everybody is kind of in their own groups now and their cultures. And so now we have this new character that's going to come on the scene, and God is showing how he has continued this through the descendants of Shem.
And so, I see it. Most of this is just basically the fastest way possible to introduce Abraham.
Right. Yeah.
Well, there is some balance here too. People have noted that there are 10 generations that are mentioned when in the genealogy from Adam to Noah, and now again 10 from Noah to Abram. And so, just noticing the balance there, that there's 10 and 10. Chapter 12. So one of the first things that I would mention is 1 through 3 is absolutely huge, right? Even if you don't take Genesis 3:15 to be a messianic promise, then at the very least you have to start seeing the messianic promise
you can't
within
miss it
this,
here,
right?
It's like,
And it's alluded to and quite directly referred to later on in Scripture, later on in the New Testament especially, but that this is the Abrahamic covenant by and large, it's building. And I would definitely see it as building on Genesis 3:15. And part of that just because it corresponds to the curses. The curse that God had given, this is an answer to that curse. And so again, at the very least, it is answering the curse.
and so some of the questions that
3.
would come up, would they have understood this to be messianic?
And with Abraham, hopefully so.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With the Genesis, I do believe that they would have seen that. And part of that is because I believe that they've very much had more revelation from God
I think so.
than is recorded.
Right. Yeah. Less evidence of Genesis from our perspective. But with this one, I say, no, I feel like we've got some evidence, particularly when you get down to Jacob. He actually says that the scepter is never going to leave from Judah until whose rightful possession it is comes.
Yeah.
And so he has a real clear understanding of what's coming. I think, like you said, there's a lot of revelation that is not recorded for us that these people understood was going to happen, how God was going to resolve things.
Well, and the main thing, too, when I go back to Genesis 3 and the cursing, that when Paul speaks of it in the New Testament, he's talking in the same type of idea that there is a scepter that God has given to Adam to be, you're going to have dominion over the earth. And with the fall, that scepter is dropped. And so I've heard professors talk about it in terms of he set down the scepter in order to take the fruit. And then once he took the fruit, he wasn't worthy, maybe Thor type thing. He wasn't worthy to take the scepter back up, but he had lost his position. He lost his authority. And so now when you get to Jesus, Jesus is the one who is able to take that scepter back, the only one that is rightful and able. It's that idea of first Adam, second Adam.
Gotcha.
So
for me, one of the key pieces of this is that I would spend some time on if I were developing a sermon is this idea that God is going to use Abraham to basically exemplify himself. That he was going to be basically the poster child for what life is like with God. So he's chosen Abraham, yes. God is for sure the one that instigated all this.
Yes.
And so, that affects theology. But within that, it's like your name's going to be great. You're going to be basically the picture that's going to attract the other nations. It wasn't that God says, hey, it's just going to be about you and me and everybody else is out. It's like, no, the way I work through you is going to suck everybody else in. And that was the original design. And so Israel obviously got that wrong. They became very nationalistic in their approach to things. And like, no, we're Israel and everybody else is, you're just the Gentiles. We're God's people and you're not. Type thing. But that was not the original design. The original design is that God was going to bless Abraham so tremendously that it was going to attract the other nations. So we get to see that play out through the records of Abraham. And so here's what's amazing. Everything that happened to Abraham, he lands on his feet, right?
Yeah.
So he gives his wife to the king of Egypt. Basically, he takes him. And they think, okay, well, this is bad. No, God God saves him, and he is made more wealthy because of this.
Yeah.
I mean, he gets all this stuff. I was like, okay, wow. For anybody else, that's not how that's working out.
Yeah.
But for Abraham, yes. Chapter 13, we see Abraham's very wealthy. You get to 14. It's you kind of get some more of this thing. He has 318 people that have been born in his household. We're just again getting a perspective of how wealthy God has made Abraham.
Yeah.
There's like 318 that's born in his household that are trained. These are his soldiers, etc. And it continues. Let's see, was over in 20.
You're right. It's not even just with Abraham. It's also with
Yes.
Jacob later,
Yep.
with the flocks and everything.
And so we
Laban.
see right away, it's not like this is something that God's going to do later on. Right away, God is already just fixing everything. It's like, I mean, even though Abraham can't get out of his own way sometimes with some of his just bonehead decisions, right? Which, is encouraging for us, should be encouraging for us, that God is really helping us more than we even realize. And so not only does God fix the problems that Abraham's creating, but he also blesses them in the process. It's like, well, Abraham, if you want to use these words, basically sinned in lying about his wife, right? Yeah, sister, yes, but that was deceptive. And so
Yeah,
it's,
it was- the
and so it's a
motivation
lie.
was
If it's
deceptive.
deceptive, it's a lie.
Right.
And so that's a lie. It's a sin. So he sinned, and yet God blessed him. And so we cannot get away from that reality because it's so much of God's nature. Does God, promote sin? Absolutely not. But God is good all the time.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing when we see it in his life. And we even get over to New Testament. It says it's the goodness of God that leads us to repentance when we begin to realize, hey, I blew it and God gave me something good in exchange for my bad. Nobody else does that. I mean, you do bad to us and we might not give you anything, which is the best we can get.
Yeah, and especially when it's a repeat offender.
Right. Yeah. It's like,
and he
you know
is.
what? I'm not going to react to that even though I want to. I'm just not. And so that's as good as it gets for us.
Yeah.
But God says, you know what? I'm going to bless you. It's like, what? I'm going to give you something good in exchange for your bad. And so that's again coming back to the reality of God's nature that we see all the way back to Abraham and consistently through the Gospels.
Essentially, when we talk about 12:1 and 3 in particular, answering the curse, some of the things that I'm seeing is when you have the barrenness as we fast forward and unfold the story, the barrenness of Sarah, the promise of Genesis 3 and the curse of basically the pain in childbearing. Part of the pain in childbearing is for the ones who are unable to have children that desire it. And so he's reversing that, and he's giving a blessing instead of a cursing. And so it's not even just being able to have children, but it's that now you have this legacy, you have this whole descendant, this nation, this people, essentially. The ground, when God is saying, I'm going to give you all this stuff, and we're seeing it, that, it increases in just the crops that he might have, which he's not really staying in one place and planting, but at the same time it's the flocks, right?
Yeah.
And so the opening of the wombs of even the cattle is seen as a blessing. And then, of course, with the cursing, the blessing those who bless and cursing those who curse is that idea of, having the, in some ways, authority, if you will.
Yeah. And we see this play out again. This is moving into the future, but we'll get there with Jacob and Laban and how difficult Laban was toward Jacob and how it resulted in
times.
his decline.
Yeah.
He kept losing. Jacob kept growing. And I was like,
You want to double or nothing this?
that's why. So you think you figure this equation out at some point, and
Yeah.
you get on the right side of it. And so we see this working out through his descendants as well.
Yeah, this is like obviously one of the more pivotal moments in Genesis, but I was looking into some of the background of it, and according to Jewish tradition, Terah and in the land that they were in was a very polytheistic area, and Terah was a idol maker. I don't know who came up with that or what tradition they found it in, but someone wrote it down in a couple of places, so they got
Supply and demand.
Yeah.
People looking for idols, we can make something.
yeah, so Terah was an idol maker, and so that was the kind of family that Abraham was born into. I couldn't quote the name of the, whatever writing this was in because I can't say it because I physically cannot pronounce it. But it said that Terah brings Abram into the area that he is where he's built all these idols, and he's like, Abram, look at all this that we have to worship and to basically make the gods proud with our lives. Then, if you understand that and if that's real, then this call from the one true God is very contrary to that. So he's pulling Abram out of that culture, and now he's going to basically say, Abram, now you are going to be the vessel in which I will, show myself off to.
Yes.
And so it seems, as it's written, without hesitation, Abram's like, all right, I'll go. And that's where we
Yeah.
start. His believing in God is credited to him as righteousness, as right off the bat. He just picks up what he has and he goes.
Yeah, and there's no good reason for it.
Right.
It's not like, hey, I'm going to go over here because that land's better, or because he don't even know where he's going.
Right.
God tells him, I'll show you on the way. Maybe he had an idea. I don't know. But the reality is that it's not because there was some financially lucrative reason for this, which is how we make all of our decisions, right?
Right.
Yeah, we'll leave this area and this job and go to that area and that job because, we're going to get paid more money. There's no good reason. He has family here. There's a business here. They're lucrative here. They've got plenty of stuff here. It's for him to leave is only going to be hardship.
Yeah.
There's nothing easier about that.
Also, the name Abram means exalted father, and he has no children. So from birth, he has been named exalted father, but it's like this waiting game to see, is this actually, am I going to live up to my name?
Oh, so fun.
So, yeah.
So much of God's way is that way. Well, and we see this issue with childbearing and a lot of his descendants too. Isaac had similar situation. Even Jacob with Rachel had similar situations. Whereas dependent upon the Lord.
And just to give people a heads up on the timeline, we may come back to this as well, but Abraham is when he's called in chapter 12, he was 75. We see that in 12:4. Ishmael was born when he was 86. You can see that in 16:16. Abraham was 99 when the angel came and said, no, this is Isaac.
Right.
And so essentially you're saying he's waiting 25 years for the son of promise, and even 11 years just for a son, period.
Right.
And so in this waiting, when we think about, like, just to give some context, we fast forward a little bit to Ishmael and Hagar and that whole situation, but just understand that God is not moving quickly on Abraham's timetable. Let's put it that way. The other things that I was seeing too is that this whole scenario of Abram in Egypt, it very much correlates to the Israelites' time in Egypt and everything. Now, of course, some of the timetable is a little bit different in terms of the plagues come after as opposed to before. So the famine drives them down to Egypt. And that's kind of the same way with Jacob's family going into Egypt. Sarai was taken into the harem, and the Israelites were the slaves of Egypt, and so there's similarity that way. The wealth of Egypt ends up transferring to Abram, and same with the Israelites when they leave. And then the plagues, as a curse to give freedom. There's all similarities within all of this. Interesting to see how God is sometimes working the same thing. Working through the same things.
We can also see that God obviously cares more about the sanctity of marriage than Abraham does.
Yeah, well, and it's funny too, because later on we find out that he says, anywhere we go, agree with me that I'm going to tell him that you're my sister, and you'll agree and say, yeah, he's my brother. And so he kind of sets this up as a standard of practice.
Yeah.
And
That was
so
him
we see-
explaining it to Abimelech. So this was,
Yeah.
it seems like that's the last time, but
It was
how
the
many
second recorded time.
Right.
Yeah.
How many times did this happen before then?
Yeah,
So-
exactly.
I got questions.
Yeah.
I got lots of questions.
Well, and then
So they're gonna
Isaac does the
take
same
you
thing to
and,
Rebecca.
I just find another wife. It's
Yeah.
fine. I mean, even just to come up with that plan, your opinion about marriage is
Well, and he's afraid.
he's afraid.
Yeah.
Yes. And so my fear, I would be more afraid of somebody taking my wife to my life, but not him. And I really do believe that's true of me. I really do believe, in that scenario, it's like, no, I'll die. At that point, they'll have you either way, right? I suppose. I'd love to go back and ask him questions. I guess maybe one day we can.
But it's also, even in the stories that we'll come across, even in Genesis, it's not the last that we're going to be like, wait, what?
Yeah. Well, and this happens
So-
again in his offspring, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Isaac and
Isaac,
Rebecca,
yeah.
and then you've got
Isaac
Lot
also
and the
with
whole situation.
Abimelech.
Yeah.
At some point, Abimelech was like, dude,
Every
what is up
every
with your
Jewish
family, man?
Yeah, everybody that comes from his family. Wait, who are you related to?
it's like, Abraham, you got to get.
Let's just not take any women from among this family.
Yeah.
So, chapter 13, Abram, you were talking about the wealth of Abraham. We're just going to use his name interchangeably, which, exalted father, and then it's father of multitude when he switches to Abraham.
Right,
But that's, side note. One of the things, one of the first questions that I have, when Abram and Lot go together, why Lot was there with him. I have no idea if you guys came across that. That was just a general wondering that I had.
His brother died.
Yeah. So, I mean, but he left the rest of his family.
He did.
So I was like, why would he bring?
Lot
I guess
wanted to
maybe
go,
Lot
I
was
guess.
Just got to figure that maybe Abraham was
he took care of
the
him.
older sibling.
Yeah.
And so, I could see it from a brother's perspective.
Yeah.
So-
So they both had a lot,
Yeah.
and apparently too much to be able to stay in the same land. So they had to.
So, obviously Lot inherited his father's.
Yeah.
What's interesting too is that in the promise of God to Abraham, he says, I'm going to give you the land of Canaan. we come to this hardship because of the blessing of God. Now there is a hardship for them to deal with. And so they've got to say, okay, we're going to split ways. We're going to, settle in different areas. Abraham goes to Lot and he says, hey, I'm going to let you choose first. But in the way that it's chosen, the land of Canaan essentially falls to Abraham.
Right.
And then Lot ends up going to Sodom and Gomorrah, near Sodom and Gomorrah at that point. But then obviously he makes his way into the city. And so God is protecting, but he's also like just working what he said he was going to do in the first place. And I tend to wonder if Abraham was sitting back thinking like, I'm cool because God's got me. I know where I'm going anyway. Maybe he kind of knew where Lot was going to go. Maybe he had already looked out and he was like, you know what? Lot's going to choose over there.
Guaranteed, right? Yeah.
Whatever it might have been. But I just thought it was interesting that, God has set it ahead of time, and that's how it happens.
Yep. So that was the solution to strife. They separated ways.
My other question, though, too, came with, was it all the land of Canaan? I didn't look into that. Have you guys looked at maps or anything?
Yes, I have. Now, so you have 3 different descriptions of the land that's been given to Israel in the Bible. Israel has never actually owned the full description of God's given territory. So there is a map. I felt like I had it in a sermon recently, but it shows how far up and over the land is supposed to go, and it is quite large. I mean, well beyond the river, the seas, the Dead Sea, and all that. It's over, and then all the way down to Egypt, even consuming some of the northern territory of Egypt, and then back up around the Mediterranean. It's a large piece of land.
Yeah. So Sodom and Gomorrah could have been technically part of Canaan as well.
Well, in the original description, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So for chapter 14, I think Josh needs to just go ahead and read all this. I want to hear him say all these names.
I can summarize it for you.
No, I'm just saying. I want to hear you say all the names.
Chedorlaomer is the only one right?
Nope.
We're going to call him Chad.
Yeah.
Ellie.
King Cheddar.
King Cheddar.
I wonder if he was large. It just feels large, doesn't it? King Cheddar.
I didn't look in to see what the beef was with these kings, if I just kind of skipped over it when I was reading. But they just came up.
Weren't they subservient to a degree, and then they're like, hey, we're done with that? And then they said, okay, we'll see about it?
Yeah, so in verse 4, 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer. In the 13th year, they rebelled. And so there's definitely some sort of, mutiny, basically.
Right. Yep. So the 4 kings came and attacked the 5 kings, I think. Is that how that went?
Yeah, they're in verse 9, 4 against 5.
And so the 4 won. And then Abraham, who was not even a king,
beat
all 4 of them.
It didn't even mean anything to him until Lot was captured.
That's right.
So,
Yeah.
Then it became personal.
Yep, Lot and all the possessions and everything. And
So Abraham was like, well, all right, guys. We only got 318 of us, but
so I can hear Abraham's like, I've got a certain set of skills.
So after all that, then this is where Melchizedek enters the picture. And we've talked and referred to him a little bit, especially back in Hebrews. So let's kind of rehash that a little bit. So he's mentioned as the king of Salem, but he kind of comes out of nowhere. This is basically all we hear about him. And he blesses Abraham. Abraham gives him a tenth.
Right.
And so let's kind of talk through that a little bit.
Well, it set up something that's going to, we don't even catch. If this is, until you've read something else, you wouldn't even catch it here, right? Not until we get to Hebrews that we're going to, oh, that's what that was about.
Yeah.
And so it sets up a bit of a hierarchy that God is pointing to, that he wanted to establish right now because he knew we were going to come back to it later. And there is a priesthood, number one, that's going to be greater than the priesthood that comes from Abraham. How do we know that? Because Abraham pays tithes to Melchizedek, and Melchizedek blesses Abraham. And so the lesser is blessed by the greater. And so God points that out again over in Hebrews.
Yeah.
And so the Levites and all those who were in Abraham, is how God sees it, paid tithes to Melchizedek. And so it's this thing flows up in that point. And so he established that there is a priesthood that is greater than the Levitical priesthood.
Yeah.
Yeah, and essentially one of the things that I'm seeing too is that Melchizedek being a priest, before the priesthood is established, he had to have been, if he is, as it's mentioned, a priest of the God Most High, then this is not, he's got all these gods. He's been called out by God in the same way that God has called Abraham. And so because of that, and because Abraham is mentioned, he's described as a prophet, but definitely not a priest. And later on, when we see the kings and everything, then the priest and the kings were supposed to be separate and always be separate, and that's what causes trouble later on. And so, within this, God seems to be okay with it, that he's king and priest. There's a lot of nuances here, I think.
I was reading somewhere that they attribute the king of Sodom's name to mean son of evil. And I don't know if that's real, because another thing I read said that his name was Berah, which means gift. That kind of makes more sense with the reading to me. But if we're gonna go with the son of evil, then it's the son of evil with the
Son of
king
peace.
of righteousness, and so the king of righteousness only offers Abraham bread and wine, but the son of evil says you can take all this stuff, and so we have this picture of, and so if his name means gift, which makes more sense to me in the reading because he wants to gift Abraham all this stuff. Abraham is blessed more by the gift of the bread and wine, and that's just because of the person of Melchizedek. And so I just was taking note of those kind of correlations.
Yeah, and you're right. It is interesting, especially when you come back down to 23. Abraham doesn't take anything from him, from the kingdom of Sodom
Right.
or any others, because he's like, I don't want you to be able to come and say that I have made Abraham rich.
Right.
But yet he does accept, and then he also tithes to Melchizedek.
Right.
Well, and so I wrote down for that faith fuels integrity. Whenever we're really trusting God, then we're not so trusting that we have to have it from other sources, right? That God will provide. And so we see that here in Abraham's life where he's convinced that God will make him rich, and he's got reason to be convinced, right?
Yeah.
God
Yeah.
has already made him rich.
Yeah.
So I would wonder what is different about this situation than being kicked out of Egypt and the Pharaoh saying, here's all this
Right.
stuff.
Yeah, take
Yeah.
this.
And so why did he take that and not take this? Because I think in both situations you could say, I'm not going to take that because God will take care of me. I don't know, because I could see God saying, yeah, take that stuff because this is the way I'm providing for you. But he obviously felt something in his heart where he was like, I'm not going to take this because God will take care of me.
So my knee jerk to put it in black and white terms that God used the enemies of God to enrich Abraham rather than the servants of God. It seems. And so, hey, if taking it from these people who don't worship God, all right, then we're just transferring wealth from that side to this side. Whereas these guys are in it together, basically. And that's a very black and white perspective. And it could be off, but that's just my knee jerk. That's
Yeah, I mean, I don't really care either way.
Yeah, that's- I mean,
when
that's-
it comes down to it, because I'm just reading what it says.
gonna be on the quiz.
right? It's gonna be on the quiz.
you get to the gate, it's like, hey, fill this quiz out. We'll see if you get in or not.
Why did Abraham take from the Pharaoh but not from the king of Sodom?
Crud, I remember reading this. What was the answer on that one?
I think the answer would be
It's D,
because
all of the
Abraham
above.
said, "I'm not going to,"
That's it. Yeah.
because whatever was in his heart. The covenant that he made with the Lord right there, I'm not going to take from you, because then you could say that you made me rich.
Yeah.
And I want the Lord to say
Well,
that he made me rich.
And it comes all the way back to the fact when he pursued the people, it wasn't for the stuff, it was for the salvation of the people, which, we
Yep.
could continue to preach that on down the line a little bit. All right, 15.
Yeah, 15. So he further solidifies the covenant. This is one of the things that we see that's interesting with Abraham. God allows him to question him at multiple different points and doesn't get mad, whereas other times it seems like people will question God and God's like, who are you? Just shut up and go along with what I've told you, right? And so, again, this is where the timeline kind of comes into play. And so at this point, Abraham still doesn't have a child, even though the covenant has been established, or the call, I guess, if you will. And so this is really where the covenant comes into play. And so, Abraham's like, how can I be having descendants more numerous than the stars, that type of thing, if I don't have a son, if I don't have somebody to start it off? And so this is where God kind of answers that.
And so I think God reestablishes the covenant at least 3 times in Abraham's life, which is beautiful. And so you think, well, did he need it 3 times? Yeah. Yeah, I think he did. Again, it comes back to the fragile nature of mankind, right? God says, I got you. And then, we'll go a few minutes down the road. It's like, are you sure? It's like, yes, I got you. A few minutes later, are you sure? We had that as our, particularly our youngest child, Ruger. I mean, for years of his life, he would do this. We'd just be in the house, nothing's going on. And he's like, Mom. Like, yeah. And nothing would happen. He's just pinging.
Yeah.
Make sure we're still there. Still got you.
Yeah.
This went on for years and and it took us probably 6 months or better to realize what he was doing.
Yeah.
It was like, because we were starting to get frustrated. It was like, dude, why are you
What do you
calling
want?
name?
Yeah.
You calling name? What you need? Nothing. Never mind. I was like, then we started realizing, okay, he just needs reassurance. It was weird to us because it's not like we'd ever left him anywhere.
Yeah.
Like there's no history here to make him that insecure, right? But yet we are insecure by our sin nature, I think.
Yeah.
And so God knows that, and it's just, again, his nature to be everything we need.
Well, and he starts off with that, fear not, because I'm your shield and your reward. And your reward is going to be great. It's similar to Isaiah 41:10. And so there's a few things in here that I do want to kind of ask you guys about, see what you think. So when God comes to Abraham and he's kind of giving him this covenant, then he calls him and he says, hey, here's how many animals you need to bring. So he says, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, turtle dove, young pigeon, basically everything but the birds cut in half, set them opposing to one another. Then when the sun goes down, a deep sleep falls on Abram. So this is same terminology as with Adam when Eve was formed from his rib. And so he's put in this deep sleep, and what is described as a dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. I didn't know if you guys had any insight, first of all, on that darkness and dreadful.
I feel like you're asking because you got something.
I'm not. I don't. I mean, I have thoughts, but I
don't know.
I just don't know. So to me, it feels like if this were the glory of God, which is what I would anticipate, right?
Mm-hmm.
You would anticipate that because God is coming down, and we see the the presence of God is at least symbolized in what is it, fiery kettle and the smoking. I can't remember, flaming torch in the smoking pot. That's right. We can kind of see that as a pillar of fire, pillar of cloud, that type of thing as far as in the wilderness. But when these things are going through in between and Abraham is sleeping, then I would anticipate that this is kind of a positive thing, in terms of this is the weight of God, right? It's the weight of glory in a sense. And so Abraham is put to sleep, but the fact that it's portrayed in negative types of wording is what is kind of opposite of what I would kind of assume.
The great
like
terror
instead of
overwhelmed
glorious.
him. Well, I don't think it's uncommon. So we find the same thing even with Daniel.
Yeah.
It's like, so he was so terrified that, he couldn't even stand up like a dead man on the ground until, God restored him.
Yeah. So the only thing that I would think, or where my mind goes to, is it would be similar to the mountain when Moses was up there with the presence of God. Mm-hmm. I guess one of the things that I bring that up is because even though I may try to anticipate, well, this is, when we speak of the glory of God, we speak of it as being light and it brings comfort. But at the same time, we also, the other side of it is that it could be described as dreadful and great darkness in the sense of, God's command and the fear that is within that for the glory of God, because the mountain, it was thunderous, it was a storm, it was, that type of thing.
And I'm sure there's more here than what we've scratched at yet. I just the whole smoking fire pot and flaming torch. There's maybe some shadow in that, but there's probably something even deeper than what we realize. And I believe that true about all the Word of God. Honestly, anytime I find something, I was like, man, that was a jewel, and I bet there's an old under it, and there usually is. I do understand the custom here is, pieces of animals divided, that what's being said here is if I don't maintain this covenant, then let it be like this unto me, right? It's kind of their tradition of how they would make this type of covenant. So God is using a human instrument to, again, give Abraham the security that he needs in his belief system. And so that's kind of, again, just beautiful of God and his nature. And he also gives them a lot more information. It's like, hey, look, I'm going to go and tell it all to you. Here's,
even predicting the 400 years in Egypt, right?
We go fast forward about 500 years of stuff here.
Yeah. So in verse 6, we need to not read past that, or not,
I agree.
Without acknowledging that he believed the Lord and it was counted to him as righteousness. And this is one of those things where it's become so familiar to us that we can read over it. But to just stop and think, okay, Abraham was considered righteous in God's eyes because he believed, not because of his actions, not because just was he faithful enough, to where it tipped the scales. No, I mean, he believed the word of God and it was credited to him as righteousness. And we see that reiterated in the New Testament, several different places. And so it's this total paradigm shift, if you will. And when I would hope and I would think that some of the scribes, some of the Pharisees, some of the other people, the Jewish leaders of the day, when they've got these scriptures, that looking back on that they would start to see that as well.
Yeah.
And perhaps their minds be
and
changed.
faith precedes sight, right?
Yeah.
This sure, he'd already tasted and seen that the Lord is good. I mean, God has already been real good to Abraham. But the major piece of this puzzle was this people that was coming from him. This again, all the way back to his name, right? He was going to be a father, and he was not. And so he, in this moment, agreed more with what God said than what his life experience was teaching him.
And so we get to chapter 16, and we finally get to Sarah and Hagar, Sarai,
what
at
a
this
mess.
point. Yeah, and it is. And so they have waited a little while from the original call. It has been, at this point, let's say 10, 11 years. And Sarah's like, well, it's not happening by me. So here's my plan. Here's what I think should happen. And you got to wonder, because of her reaction afterwards, once Hagar became pregnant, and of course now given Hagar's response to lord it over Sarai, that's another story. But still, you got to wonder if Sarah, even though she's saying this to Abraham, she's really like hesitant about it. She really doesn't want this to happen, almost to the point where it's like, are you just testing your husband, like to see if he'll go along with it? But of course, Abraham definitely didn't stand up, didn't follow through. And so in the same ways that we see great faith by Abraham, we also see other times where it's like, dude, what are you even thinking?
Yeah. So I see a big parallel here. And what stuck out to me was in verse 2 where it says, Abram did what Sarai told him.
Yeah.
And that sounds very familiar to me because in chapter 3, when God's giving the curses to the serpent, Eve, and Adam, the thing he says to him in verse 17 is, because you obeyed your wife. And so we have what God has said, and then we've had what, in these two cases, what your wife has said.
No, just
and
go ahead and generalize.
Yeah.
Preach.
So we have, the word of God versus the word of man.
That's
and
it,
so
yeah.
here
It's
he
not that
hears
it's the word of a female. It's just
right,
the word
it's
of
the
man.
word of
Yes.
the word of mankind. And so here he hears the word of mankind, and he's like, you know what? That does sound pretty good. It's kind of enticing. I think you might be onto something. And that's exactly what happened in the garden. And so this is, I think, just another parallel of that situation. God had a plan in place, and Abraham believed that, and yet he still was like, you know what? Let's do it this way. See what happens.
Like if we actually put ourselves in their shoes, that is what makes the most sense.
It does.
I mean, from a human perspective, then it makes total sense. And we see that even more clearly later on, because when Isaac is promised, then Abraham laughs and he's like, we're both good as dead. So how is this going to be? Yeah, from their perspective, this is what makes sense. I'm gonna make it work.
Natural
So
logic is so often opposed to spiritual faith.
Yeah.
It's like, here's a way that seems right unto man, but in thereof is the ways of death, right? Our natural logic just does not produce it. And so each time we come up with a thing, all right, this seems logical, then wait a minute, we come up with a lot of scenarios in life that seem logical.
Yeah.
And yet we know that it is sinful.
And another thing is Sarai bringing the blame back on Abram.
Love that.
Yeah.
Like, this is just classic marriage right here.
Yeah.
You did this to me. It's like, wait a minute. I mean, I guess I'm part of it, but come on, you don't feel any responsibility.
Well,
in this?
and I don't know whether her attitude was accusatory, even when in verse 2 when she says the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. So I don't know if that's more of a fact of the matter type thing that she's saying, or if that's like she's actually accusing God. Like she's kind of like, well, it's God's fault, like, and she's bitter about it in a sense. And so that's why she's come up with this plan.
Verse 5,
yeah,
though,
that's what I was referring to.
you
Verse 5.
have brought this wrong on me.
Yeah.
It's 100%
Well,
Abraham
correct.
at this
I
point.
know, but I'm saying like as far as Sarai's attitude in general, if she is accusing God in a sense, then makes it even more natural that she would then pass the blame on Abraham when he actually goes along with it.
Gotcha.
Because she may just be,
okay.
Upset and bitter and the whole nine.
When we rarely pause to think about this from her perspective. God has promised her husband that he's going to have a great nation, and she can't produce a child. You cannot imagine the weight that would have, the stress, how much that would eat at her. It's like, hey, I'm preventing him from fulfilling God's plan for his life.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I mean. Like, you can't imagine that she doesn't have those thoughts as far as why has God done this to me?
Yep.
And so that's one of the reasons why I wonder if it was somewhat accusatory. And again, I'm not, not in an excusive type way, but just in an understanding type of way to see, man, yeah, if she's 65, if Abraham, let's see, when Ishmael is born, he's 86. And so if she's roughly 10 years younger, then she's 76. And so that means she's gone this whole time without having any children. And so she's known this whole time that she's not been giving children. So it's been eaten away, I'm sure.
50 years probably.
Yeah. The other thing that I would want to mention in 16:2 is that there are huge implications of this sin, Abraham's lack of faith, if you will. I mean, I would call it sin, but, without waiting on the Lord, and not to over spiritualize it, but some of the things that I wrote down was the results are you've got contempt between Hagar and Sarah. That's verse 4 and other places. You've got a messed up relationship between Abraham and Sarah, for sure. You see that in verse 5, like we just mentioned. Ishmael teases Isaac, and you've got the whole enmity between the generations that follow.
Oh, my goodness.
I mean, so that's huge.
Right.
Hagar and Ishmael, they're sent away in 21, which we'll deal with a little bit later, but even just the turmoil and the hopelessness of that whole case, that's huge, and how much it affected Hagar and Ishmael.
So Sarah's solution to this was to mistreat Hagar.
Yeah.
Well, so to some degree, I guess you want to put her back in her place, and whether that's right or wrong, we can understand some of that. And so Hagar runs away.
Which is what her name means.
Yeah.
I looked that up.
Saw this coming, Hagar.
Yeah.
Here's what's most amazing. It's the angel comes to her and says, hey, go back and be submissive. I was like, wow, but I'm being mistreated. Yes, but be submissive. But she don't like me. Yeah, but be submissive. I was like, this is teaching for us. Yeah, sometimes we just submit to things that are not right for a greater good. We're so full of ourselves sometimes that we just can't submit to mistreatment. That is a bridge too far for most people. And yet God tells her, submit to it.
Do you suppose that there's God's grace kind of intermingling, maybe intermingling is the wrong word, but it coexists with the rejection? So you've got Hagar who is sent away, and God, of course, sees her, and he says that he sees her, and even Ishmael, God sees, and that type of idea, even within his name. And so, or God hears. And so he also says that Ishmael is going to be a wild donkey, and that all these people are going to be against him, and he's going to be against them. And so it's like Hagar is comforted by the fact that, okay, yes, I hear you. I've got you. I'm protecting you. I'm going to make him into a great nation as well. In fact, it mentions 12 princes that are going to come, and that's kind of like 12 tribes in the same way that Jacob will have 12 tribes. And so, you see all this blessing, but then there's also this idea of rejection in a sense too, just the fact that it's not the line, the line of the Messiah. I don't know. Thoughts?
You think Ishmael was spoiled?
I mean, spoiled from what perspective?
His father's 86 years old. This is his only child.
Yeah.
And his father's extremely wealthy. Spoiled from the perspective of, he probably got away with a lot.
Yeah.
He was obviously, I'm sure, doted on, which I don't know. Probably Sarah didn't love that either. But you got to imagine, too, at some point when he's finally born, that Sarah's going to love the child as well, at least until he gets in his own way.
Yeah.
Which he's going to here in a minute.
Yeah. Yeah. So just something I was thinking about and continue to think about. And I don't think this is the only place that we see that.
No.
But
so 17 years later, the Lord appeared to Abraham. Did he appear to him between those times? We don't know, but this is just 17 years later.
99 years old, yeah.
Yeah.
He identifies himself, I am God Almighty. This is the El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless. And I think one of the first things that I see here is that Abraham has already believed God. It is counted to him as righteousness. And so in that sense, we would call that saved. And yet this is when God is calling him to be blameless and walk before him in a holy manner.
Yeah.
Because without God and without being saved, how can you?
Yeah. And
so just kind of bringing that
produce
up.
works of righteousness, basically.
Yeah.
And it's symbols of our relationship. And so, we even come down to the idea of the symbol of that they would have in their flesh.
And I would also notice too, in verse 2, when he says, I will make my covenant between me and you and multiply you greatly, Abraham's response is to fall on his face. The idea of worship as a result of just being in the presence and being under the command of God and being under, perhaps blessing even within God. It doesn't say that he worships him directly, but at the same time, falling on his face is certainly an act of submission.
Right.
And therefore, I would think, seeing because of God's worthiness that he is bowing down, he is covering. And this is where he changes his name. So his name will be Abraham, which is the father of a multitude. So not just exalted father, but now a father of multitudes.
Many nations.
What else are we seeing here besides just this sign of a covenant? That's fun.
So it's
go ahead.
we will have to talk about it, right?
Yeah, we have to.
Yeah.
Because it's on the surface it's weird.
Absolutely. And everybody outside of the
Yes.
faith is going to look at this and be like, you follow a God that commands people to mutilate yourself.
Yeah, right.
Like,
But what do you think, Josh? You've got some thoughts on this. You've done some reading.
No. I mean, I do, I understand that this is weird, as we read it, but also this is like one of the most intimate parts of your body.
Yes, that's right.
And you have to now do something that does not feel great.
Yeah.
And so it's not going to be a sign that everybody sees also, because unless you just walk around naked, then does everybody see this? So, it really is when God says this is a covenant between me and you, like this is your sign to be able to know that, okay, God has called me to do something and he's promised me something and I'm going to believe him.
Yeah. And I think it's not by accident that it is on the most intimate part.
Right.
So if we want to use the terminology, man's prized possession, right? It's like, so God is calling us to sacrifice that which is very valuable to us. I mean, and it's not from a macho man perspective, but in just the reality, this is the very appendage that will create and that we'll have our offsprings, and and it's
Yeah.
going to be this major importance, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not by accident that this is going to carry the symbol.
Yeah, and I think that is just it. It's, are you trusting God when the promise lies in, the promise is, I'm going to make you into a great nation, and so you're going to have offspring. This is in the middle of, he's saying, hey, you've got Ishmael, Isaac is coming, that he's saying you've got to do this, and
Which
it
is
shows trust and faith.
is going to slow down the process for a minute, right?
Yeah. And, well, it is funny to me that he's like, after this happens, then we get the impression that he's just kind of sitting around. So like in chapter 18, verse 1, he says, the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre. He sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. And it's kind of like, is he still healing?
No,
But
it is humorous.
he follows through, and this is not just, what's crazy too is that you've got to think that these guys are actually servants and slaves, if you will, because there's no other way that these guys are like, yeah, I'll go along with that.
Yeah.
Right. Now all of a sudden, all these other people that are his, because the command is any purchased person, essentially.
Let's just point out too that these people have lived in his household and have seen Abraham's faith firsthand.
Yeah.
It's not something that they just showed up and like, whoa, that's part of the job description. It's this is something that's like, okay, I mean, we know that this man has a relationship with Almighty God.
Yeah.
And God has told him this. I don't think it would have been a lot of pushback.
Yeah. Well, and also the fact that he did it to himself
Yeah.
Yeah.
would be an example.
Yeah.
Like, this is not just for you. This is for me too.
As one of my kids asked me, did they shave? This came up in small group. Based on what they were doing, I'm certain they could shave. Somebody somewhere had a sharp knife.
Probably not as sharp as a scalpel.
No, it's never going to be sharp enough. I'm sure of that. But it's and so let's talk about it just from the perspective of today's society. Is this a necessary thing for believers?
Well, no, Galatians tells us
No.
that.
That's right.
No.
In fact, at some point in the first century, it was a problem. It was a hindrance even for some of the new faith, because they were putting so much emphasis on this physical sign that they were missing the importance of a new relationship.
Well, and this is the very thing that Paul points back to in Galatians when he's saying that he's even mentioning Hagar and Sarah, that you are either a son of the child of promise
Right.
or the son of a child by who just had this physical outward modification. So it is within the heart, and it is the sign of the promise and of the covenant that is the relationship, as opposed to just by the flesh.
Yes.
So
And so he uses Hagar as a slave, and so
Yes.
the son of a slave, right?
Versus
and
the
which
free.
has some connection even to the law, that we're
Yeah.
either a slave to the law or we are sons of promise, that we have been redeemed from that.
yeah, I was trying to remember. I thought I had written down Galatians 4.
Yeah, it's Galatians
Yeah.
4.
Good job, Josh.
Every now
I had
and
to look at my
even
notes.
a blind squirrel.
Yeah. So if we can take that allegorically, how much more can we take allegorically?
It's not an allegory. This is a real story.
Well, I know, but I'm saying the way that Paul uses them.
Okay.
Yeah, he does
And-
say this is an allegory.
Yeah. It's just an example of, like, can we over spiritualize scripture? Maybe.
Sure.
But if it points to correct theology based on other scripture, no.
Well, yeah.
I'd say.
And I would also agree there's a depth here that you never get to the bottom of.
Yeah.
The more we dig, the more we find. You know, all the way back to the original languages, you continue to find stuff in the original languages that like, wow, is that intentional? And the answer is, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, God
Right.
does all this stuff intentionally that we find by accident sometimes. Like, wow, that is so deep that, is that just happenstance? No. God has designed so much, even down to the letters. That is just outrageous. Again, just more reality that it's a supernatural book.
Yeah. The second half of 17 into 18 is the promise of Isaac specifically. So now we've gotten very specific to say, no, Abraham, it's you and Sarah. Sarah's going to be the one. And so this is where she laughs, he laughs, everybody's laughing apparently. So they name him Isaac, laughter, and or something, he laughs. And so it has been brought up, because God's response is also different to Abraham versus Sarah. He calls Sarah out when we get to Sarah and she's laughing, then he calls her out and she's like, I didn't laugh. And he's like, no, you did. Kind of like this parental type of correction. And one of the things that I wonder too, and this kind of goes back to the coexisting of what we might see as opposites, but you've got joy and you've got laughter and disbelief, Isaac kind of fulfills both of those in the sense that everybody that knows him and sees this miraculous thing, because I mean, everybody is going to acknowledge that this is a miraculous birth, you know, that they are both past the point of bearing children. It even says specifically she was beyond past the years of the ways of a woman, you know, that type of thing. So she's postmenopausal. And so this is a miraculous thing that's going to happen. And so everybody that sees Isaac is going to deal with this either in a response of, wow, you know, let's see God. And so there's that joy and laughter of joy, as opposed to laughter of disbelief, which we see in Ishmael in a sense where he's like teasing him and he's laughing at him, and a lot of the nuances within how people are responding to him, the son of promise.
All right. Sodom and Gomorrah is going to be destroyed. God comes, pays Abraham a visit, decides, hey, look, we're not going to keep this from Abraham.
Yeah, so
I get the impression it's the same people that visited him and Sarah.
Yep.
And then they just get up and they're walking out and they're like, you think we should tell Abraham what's going to happen?
We probably should.
Yeah. I mean, after all.
So
He is, you know.
two questions. One, do we see this, at least one of the three, as perhaps a pre-incarnate Christ, the angel of the Lord? Even though there's three men, two of them go down, and so we see those as two angels, but the third one that stays back as the angel of the Lord, the angel of the Lord. And so is that Christ pre-incarnate, and how do we know? What's the evidence for that?
I'd have to read through it to find the evidence, but I think it's generally held that it is a Christophany.
Yeah. Well, I think some of it, as I am remembering, just the way that Abraham refers to him as Lord, and not only that, but speaking with a command and authority, I think that's a big part of it. It's kind of equating the will of God with what he is saying or stating.
Yeah. I mean, verse 22 says, the two men turned and headed toward Sodom, but Abraham was still standing before the Lord.
Yeah.
Well, and you go to verse 19. It's I have chosen him. You know, that's pretty.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
yeah.
That's pretty telling there. Isn't it? We could stop with that one. So yeah. So he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. So again, Abraham and the Lord has this whole exchange. You know, would you destroy it if there were 50 righteous?
Yeah.
Would you destroy
He's quite
it
the
if there
barterer.
were 40 righteous? And back and forth, and it's like, you know, it gets all the way down to 10, right?
Yep.
It's, if there's 10 righteous, would you preserve it? And God even says, yes, if there's 10, I would preserve it on the sake of 10 righteous people, which is unique for us, but again, points back to the effect of the righteous in inviting the grace of God on society.
Yeah.
And so it's like, even if the numbers are, you know, way tremendously out of balance, it's still, there is something there that God is very gracious toward.
Yeah. One of the things that I was seeing within this is we see it as kind of weird when in verse 17 it says, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, in terms of concerning Sodom and Gomorrah. And when I was thinking about, you know, why would he potentially keep it from him and why does he actually tell him? The only thing that I could really come up with is that God knew that he was going to spare a certain number of people, because eventually by telling Abraham, it does lead to him bartering with them and saying, you know, will you spare the city for this many people or whatever? And, you know, can we say that God would have destroyed the whole entire city right then and there, and Lot and all of his people would have been killed along with him? I don't know that we can speculate on that either way.
I don't think so.
But at the same time, I do wonder if, you know, as it works out from our human perspective, that this also leads to the fact that Abraham is now invoking the compassion of God to say, will you spare the city for this many people? And it does lead, at the very least, to saving Lot and his family.
I think Lot's salvation will be part of the program either way. From my perspective, I think what God is doing here for Abraham is preventing Abraham from indicting God as unjust. And so now Abraham has the details. So like, yeah, God's going to destroy it, but God is so merciful that even if there's 10 righteous, he won't. And so now that when he does, Abraham already has a 411 on this. All right, there was not even 10 righteous people in that city. So not only now Abraham doesn't even have the desire to indict God in this, which is our nature sometimes, right? Something bad happens, like, well, why would God do that? That seems cruel, harsh. And so that would not be his knee jerk on this. Like, no, that city was wicked, yo. Look, they didn't have 10 people in there.
Yeah.
And I had a couple, 4 at least in my family that was there that, you know, and they couldn't come up with 6 more.
Yeah.
And I was like, no,
Well,
that's on them.
Even his sons-in-law, you know, that obviously they had not yet married the daughters, but they were destroyed from what we can tell.
Yeah.
So they didn't even go along with Lot and his family.
Well, and I think the hesitancy of Lot too was kind of interesting to read. the angels are like, get your people and let's go. And Lot's like, it kind of seems that he's just kind of like hesitating to like know what to do. And, you know,
What should I pack?
right. And that's kind of like, I feel like I would be this too. Like, hold on, wait, where do I go? Okay. Yep. let me get a bag, I guess.
Can we schedule this for tomorrow?
Right. Like, I mean, I didn't have any time. And instead, you know, the angels are like, all right, well, I'm just going to grab you two. And the other angels grabs the other two. And we're going to go.
Like it.
And it was quick.
Like this thing's coming. With or without you, this thing's coming.
I see this too of, you know, a way that God preserves his people from his wrath. And, you know, even though they were preserved, I would, you know, point out to you that it wasn't perfect. They still had some suffering in a sense. They lost everything they knew. And now they have to go live in a mountain. And Lot ended up losing his wife.
Yes.
Because of her longing look towards the destruction.
Yeah, and we somehow in our minds, we're thinking they're running through the plains and the stuff's falling behind them. She's trying to look, but that is not the reality.
No.
They get to the next city, and at some point, you know, after they're already to the safety of the next city, she's like, I
Like,
sure
I kinda
do, I
wish-
sure do miss Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right, yeah.
I sure do love that place. And like, I said, oh, got it.
Yeah.
So you're with them now.
So the Valley of Siddim, I don't know if that was the one they passed through, means Valley of Salt. So
Yeah.
I can't remember, and I'm not going to take the time to read it all right here. But yeah, anyway, one of those valleys that is around there is the Valley of Salt.
Yeah, I mean, we could spend some time on just the pure wickedness of what all was going on, let alone Lot willing to give his two daughters to this mob of men to do with them what they please.
Unreasonable.
But I mean, it does, at the very least, we can't let that go in terms of, man, this is just the depravity of man. And perhaps, you know, this may even carry into even last week when we talked about, you know, is this angels intermixing with humans? If they had known that they were somehow different and they were angelic or whatever, and this was part of the reason why they were so intent on having sex with them, then perhaps that feeds into the whole idea of what they may have heard about or knew about or something
Genesis
like that before.
6, like, oh, we heard about this.
But anyway, regardless, I mean, it's just the total depravity of man, where
completely wicked.
we can't look back on it and think that there is any reasonable excuse for Lot to have the response that he did. You know, they're like, okay, well, since you're not going along with it, then we're going to drag you out. We're going to do what we want to you. And the assumption there is that they're going to then go in and do the rest. So they're like, we're going to have it all.
Yeah.
And that was all the men, young and old.
Yeah.
Evil.
Definitely wicked city for sure. So, I mean, again, my thinking goes to a lot of different things in this situation where I try to think outside of what's just written, right? So what's the scenario here and there? And so Lot's a keeper of, or herdsman, if you want to use that terminology. And that would have been a common occupation in that time period. Typically, you know, the people reside in the city, in the typically walled or gated city. Their safety designed to be that way. And then in the daytimes, they would go out and, you know, work their crops or work their herds, come back to the cities at night. And so my thinking was, did he lose everything in this? And I come back to probably not. Probably the cattle or the goat, sheep, whatever he had was probably outside the city and spared. And so he didn't lose his source of income or wealth, although it sure reads like it, right? And, you know, in my mind when I read it, it's like, okay, this guy's living in a cave now, you know, eating termites. I don't know. It's that seems rough. And definitely, perhaps not financially, there is a emotional low pictured in this story that is just the depth. This is the bottom.
Yeah.
And so maybe he loves Sodom and Gomorrah that much that, you know, he feels like he's lost everything. He has lost his wife now. That's huge. His daughters had these guys they were going to marry. You know, that didn't work out. He's lost his home. He's scared, and you can see that he is extremely afraid. And so he gets to the city. He's like, and he's not comfortable because he's so afraid. And so that's just the impact that something like this would have. And so he leaves there. It's like, I just, you know,
I'm gonna go live in a cave.
Go live in a cave, man. This is how bad it was. And so he's at the point where I'm not sure that he's actually doing his job, even though he might still have cattle. And I just feel like this guy is at an all-time low right here. That said, again, another point we don't have any information on. This is just straight Randallism right here. All these people that are living in this city probably also had some cattle and sheep and stuff. I was like, so Lot might have got real rich real fast. They're not coming back for him. So again, that's just me thinking way deep in between the lines right here, you know, as I consider the fallout from all of this stuff. And has no weight on anything. It's just, you know, if you want something to occupy your mind for a second, you can chew on that.
Yeah.
Well,
So
this is how it ends for Lot. Like,
yeah.
his daughters get him. He gets his daughters pregnant by their deception.
I didn't wanna read this stuff.
Yeah, and their lineage is the Moabites and
Ammonites.
The Ammonites.
Yep.
Yeah. And
So-
that's how it ends.
I was trying to think through like what in the world. Again, you try to figure out like motives and all that. I think that they probably saw what God was doing and destroying the city and stuff. They only saw it as strictly just judgment and not preserving.
Yeah.
And so instead of this being God's rightful, worthy wrath and judgment, then they're just seeing, well, God took from us our husbands, the ones that we were betrothed to. And so now their response is, let's take matters into our own hand. And how can we do this? Well, this was all a result of my dad or whatever. And so maybe this was a way to get even and have what they wanted. I'm not really sure exactly all the attitudes there, but still just trying to think through, man, what makes,
Well, they said
what
there's
drives
nobody in the country to sleep with.
that? Yeah.
I was like, is that your number one problem? I'm not sure. I'm not sure you're really
Well,
reading.
now given also
reading the
it's
scene
saying
out
that
here.
we may preserve offspring from our father.
Right.
So that obviously plays into it too. They're thinking, okay, well, we've got to somehow, and I don't know. Yeah, it's just messed up. Let's just put it.
Yeah,
It's just messed up.
Yeah, we're not going
So-
to be able to polish this one.
Yeah. The other thing that I do want to mention, I did look up what are the highlights of the Moabites, the Ammonites, as far as the big things. So within the Moabites, you've got Balak and Balaam, Balak in that whole story, but you also have Ruth that comes from there. And the Ammonites, they refused to help Israel in the Exodus, but God still saw them. He still protected them. He still, delivered them and all that type of stuff. But then eventually they are defeated by Saul until the kingdom splits, and then they tend to ally themselves with Israel's enemies. So
Feels right.
there's some fallout beyond just what we've got here.
And you would think, too, of all the wombs that God has closed, Lot's daughters would have been some good ones. Let's just shut them down. There's a plan and a purpose that God is able to accomplish in every bad situation, and I don't always see it. So it's just best to admit that, right? I don't know how God is ever going to use that, but, again, that's above my pay grade. I mean, maybe it's not something that he's necessarily like using for his glory, but he is just showing us the depravity of man and the depths of sin and what happens whenever we as parents continue to make compromising decisions and how that affects the next generation. Maybe that's the point of that story.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure it out. I mean, not to say that very well could be it, but
So let's just move to 20.
yep.
I mean, this is okay.
So, yeah, Abraham and Abimelech, there's basically Abraham pulls the same stunt. He's like, hey, just say that you're my sister. He does. And so then this time, instead of bringing plagues, God comes to him in a dream and just tells him flat out, this is, hey, whatever. And Abimelech is like, dude, I'm innocent. Like, I didn't do anything. I didn't know that she even said that, yeah, this is my brother. And so he's like, I'm innocent in all this. And God's like, hey, so the only reason why you're innocent is because I have protected you. But at the same time, if you don't give her back, you're going to die.
Oh, yeah.
And all your
He said,
people are going to
you're
die.
good as dead right now.
Yeah.
I mean,
And so-
talk about getting shook when you woke up.
Yeah. And so essentially, that's enough for Abimelech to be like, okay, yeah, I'll give her back. I'm good.
And he comes to Abraham's like, why did you do this to me?
Yeah. Obviously, Abraham in these particular cases, he fears men more than he fears God. Like that is the point here. Like he says, verse 11, he says, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. And so he's basically saying, okay, well, God's not perhaps going to be my protection, be my shield. He's already told him that he is. And so now he's afraid that since these people don't acknowledge God or don't fear God, that they're going to come somehow back on him and that he's going to have hardship on him. And that's just, it definitely is a very much a lack of faith on Abraham's part. And he tries to excuse it. Yeah, she really is my sister.
He blew it, and yet, Abimelech gives him sheep and cattle and male servants and 1,000 pieces of silver. Old cat lands on his feet. It's amazing the grace of God in these situations.
And then Isaac comes.
Yeah.
And so again, Isaac meaning laughter. Ishmael, as we find out a little bit later, as he's grown and he's weaned, Abraham throws a big feast, and then Ishmael is like laughing at him, making fun of him, bullying him probably. And you get that sibling rivalry times 10.
Well, it's interesting when you read this. Sometimes we forget the age of Ishmael. He's like 15 years old.
Yeah.
Because born at 86, and I was born at 100, and so 14 for sure, and perhaps then a little bit. And so we're 14, 15-year-old kid here, and so whenever they get kicked out because he's making fun of Isaac are picking on him somehow. I mean, the baby's got to be old enough to be picked on. So this is not, he's probably not a newborn. So he's 15, 16 years old at this point.
Well, and to, to that point, then, they may very well, Sarah especially, may have been worried for her own son's safety.
Yeah.
Especially if they're hearing, what, first two boys and their enmity between each other and, one kills the other, then she's like, well, this could very well happen to my son.
Yeah. Well, and there would have been a definite reality from Hagar as well as Ishmael that, hey, we are not going to be the ones that inherits here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, everything has just changed rapidly for us.
Yeah.
And so he was already now just the son of the slave woman. And so they leave, and here's what's interesting. They run out of water. They're dying.
Yeah.
And so it looks like she shoves the child like, he's a 5-year-old, but not. He's, 15, 16, maybe 17 years old. Maybe he's just already so weak that she's has to help him get under the shade. And then she goes sits down somewhere away from him, just so she can't hear him die.
Yeah.
I mean, this is desperate.
Yeah, it's hopeless. Yeah. From their perspective, it is definitely hopeless. But, again, Ishmael's name is God hears. And then, therefore, verse 17, God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you? And, of course, she's like, well, hello.
Yeah.
Like, you might hear me, but do you see me too?
Yeah.
Because this is a pretty desperate situation. And so then, as a result of that, he reiterates the fact that he's going to, make him into a great nation as well. More people are going to come from Ishmael and stuff. And he's already told Hagar that before, but, hold him fast there in verse 18, and I will make him into a great nation. Again, reiterates it. And then he opens her eyes and she sees a well of water. So, I mean, there's not just an encouragement verbally, but there's also the flat out right here, right now, help from God. And we just see the God's mercy even on an unchosen people.
Yep. We could probably skip some of the latter parts of that chapter.
Yeah. Yep. So Abimelech, obviously he sees that Abraham, God is God, and Abimelech is like, hey, we should probably make a treaty with you. So they do.
Yep.
But also, just pointing out, verse 23, swear to me right here in God's name that you will not deceive me, my children, or my descendants. And then Isaac does that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Abraham's
like, yeah, I
won't do it.
Yeah.
...
And Abimelech, his name means my father is king. So Isaac could have done it to his son.
Could have.
And so, yeah, I mean, broken treaty right there. What a mess.
Yeah.
But, God still uses all of this. Anyway, we're not there yet, so we'll get there when we get there.
The sacrifice of Isaac. I mean, we couldn't run the story without at least mentioning that, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
This is a big moment in the life of Abraham and Isaac and the development of faith for all who would come after them.
So I think one of the things, as I read this, it becomes, I don't know, in my mind, it becomes clearer and clearer that Abraham had to have known that God had the power to resurrect or bring back or save or intervene or something with Isaac. And, I know that it's not just the couple verses alone where he says that, he tells his people, I'm going to return with, we're going to return. I'm going to take him and we're going to go. We're going to offer sacrifice, come back, and we're going to return. But also that he told Isaac that God is going to provide.
Right.
Those, maybe it feels like we're reading into it, and those alone, I think, is probably not enough. But at the same time, Abraham being able to go through with that to begin with, I feel like either one of two things is true. Either that's true, or he was so engaged in the culture around him, and it was so commonplace to have child sacrifice that he's willing, that this didn't seem like a big deal. Because we look at this and we're like, how in the world could he even go along with this? Like, even if he heard it from God, and not know that God is going to somehow, this is not how God is going to do things. Like, God is going to intervene. He's going to resurrect. He's going to do something. He's certainly not going to take my son. But
well, I think to add to that and just understanding the emotion of it, not only does Abraham feel for his son and physically loves him with everything in his being, but God has also established value to Isaac because literally God had to tell Abraham, you're going to have a son whose name is Isaac, and it's going to be by your wife, Sarah. And so this is their only son together. And so not only does Abraham feel the value just inherently because his offspring, but God has assigned value to Isaac as well. And so this is just wild.
Yeah, well, and so after all the covenants that God has made with Abraham, I feel like there is such a degree of knowledge that Isaac's not going to die today. mean,
Yeah.
he can't, right? There's just no
Yeah.
way God can be true and Isaac died today, and God has always been true. And so I don't think that Abraham feels it like we feel it when we read it. I feel like his faith was that strong, his belief in God was that strong that he knew that even though he went through with it, Isaac's going to survive.
Yeah.
How? Maybe he didn't know that part.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, based on his response to Isaac saying, where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham says God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. And so, I think you're right in that he understood that God was literally going to provide for this. I know what he's told me to do. I'm going to go and do it, but God will provide.
Yeah. Yeah. So, God didn't give him all the pieces, but he knew there were some pieces there.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful too. Again, we see to save Isaac, there's a substitute. And, and so, God's pointing all that, all this is intentional.
Subtle foreshadowing.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. There's a lot here. And again, I think this is one of those things that we just dwell on and try to, think about it.
Here's what's interesting. It's, again, this is just picking out one thing, which there's a lot. Verse 18, because you have obeyed me, all the nations of the earth will pronounce blessings on one another using the name of your descendant.
Yeah.
That's so wild, isn't it? Merry Christmas. I mean, this is wild to me. How many times we say that? Is that not what he's talking about? Maybe there's more to it, but that for sure would it be included. Show me where I'm wrong.
Yeah. I mean, you're not.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's hilarious. That's beautiful. It's like you don't see it yet, but there's a day coming where people will just say over and over again, Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas. Pronounce blessings on one another in the name of your sons. But they also had other ways of doing it. May you be blessed as, Ephraim, and they had descendants there that were just so well off that they became points of blessings as well. May you be blessed and they would use some good descendant of Abraham in that.
So chapter 23, we've got the recounting of Sarah's death and burial and how Abraham goes through the whole spiel with the people, the Hittites, to buy a land or a cave, a burial plot from them. As we know, once Abraham dies, then we in 25, we see that he is buried in the same place. So we have all that. But Isaac and Rebekah, do you guys want to go into that, or do you want to just save that for next time as well?
Let's save it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Then we'll end there with the death of Sarah and just understand that God is working His plan, and there are so many different things that we could pull out as far as applications and stuff. But I think one of the biggest things is just the faithfulness of God, even in spite of the unfaithfulness of people, and we see that all throughout the Bible, and we're constantly reminded of that.
As I read the life of Abraham, I see in the characteristic of God that He always keeps His promises, and two, that His will prevail. And as many times as we as men try to mess that up, God still prevails over it because He's more powerful than us.
Yeah.
And He uses all the bad stuff and uses it for good.
Yeah. For me, sometimes I get lost in the details. Whenever I come up, try to get a bird's eye view, it's a beautiful picture. Here's God painting a story, rather than bearing down on the details of Abraham's life. We get to say, okay, here's what God is accomplishing for mankind. And so we see the pieces falling into place that God is putting together because He's doing a thing. And He's telling us about it as He paints. It's like, this stroke here is going to be like that. And the stroke, but ultimately, it's a picture of God's salvation of mankind.
Yeah.
Beautiful story. Read it. If you hadn't read it, read it. It's good. We'll see you guys next week.
Yep.